If you're looking to get into the Elektron ecosystem, or perhaps you're in the market for a high-quality synth or sampler, then the Digitakt and Digitone are two excellent options. In this video, I'm going to break down the basics of each instrument and talk about who might benefit from the Digitakt or the Digitone. So if you're looking at the Elektron lineup and considering either of these instruments, then hopefully this video will help you make a decision. The Digitakt and the Digitone have quite a bit in common, but are actually more different than they are similar, based on what you might anticipate just by looking at the two boxes. Let's take a minute to break down each one with a quick overview, starting with the hardware similarities shared between the two. So they both come in the same form factor, that same Elektron rugged metal chassis. They have backlit buttons with mechanical switches, knobs with endless encoders, and push functionality. They each have a stereo input pair and a stereo output pair, MIDI in, out, and through, a USB connection, a multi-mode filter, reverb and delay send, and the Digitone has an additional chorus effect send per track, and an overdrive per track. They also each have two assignable LFOs per track, which is one of my favorite features of the two devices. So let's talk about the differences between the Digitakt and the Digitone now, starting with the Digitakt. The Digitakt is an 8-voice drum machine slash sampler with 8 tracks of MIDI sequencing. That means that you can have 8 different samples all playing at the same time within a sequence, also while you're sequencing 8 tracks of MIDI. And I'm not going to get too much into MIDI in this video, but just know that it's a really powerful feature and both of the devices can take great advantage of other devices that have MIDI functionality. So with the Digitakt, since it's a sampler, you basically need to create or record or purchase your own samples to use as an audio source. It does come with stock samples and they're really great and high quality and you can be super creative with mangling them. But I think the whole point of a sampler is to kind of, use your own musicality to give it your own character. So you're going to want to sort of build up your own sample library if you get a sampler that you're using as your primary means of music making. And this is a really fun process and like a totally different part of the creative process in and of itself. And it's something to consider and keep in mind if you end up going with the Digitakt. So as I mentioned, it is an 8-voice sampler, so you can have up to 8 samples sequenced at the same time on a grid that is up to 64 steps per pattern. And it can be anywhere between 1 and 64 steps. And you can either manually punch those into the grid or you can live record and sort of play it like a drum machine, each different sample at the same time, like play a beat live and it will record it onto the respective spot on the grid where you played it. I tend to use both workflows. Manually entering steps is great if you want to edit as you go, or you can play it in live and then go back and manually edit the sounds as you kind of like work out the beat in your head. So that's it for the Digitakt overview. Now let's talk a little bit about the Digitone. The Digitone is an 8-voice polyphonic multi-timbral FM synthesizer rather than a sampler. Multi-timbral just means that all of the 8 voices can basically be different sounds or timbres. There are 4 tracks on the Digitone, not unlike the 8 different sample tracks of the Digitakt, where you can sequence different voices of polyphony across those 4 tracks. And in addition to these 4 tracks of synth sequencing, you also get 4 tracks of MIDI sequencing with the Digitone. So hopefully you picked up on one main difference here, and that is that the Digitone is a synth, where the Digitakt is a sampler. And basically that means that all of the sounds generated from the Digitone are actually being created in the box itself. Whereas the Digitakt, you have to put audio files or record audio files into the Digitakt, and then it's just playing those recorded files back. So the Digitone synthesizes sound and the Digitakt plays recorded sound. And now I want to jump into one of the key points of who might benefit from which of these instruments. So if you're looking for a synth, then the Digitone is your guy. You can play the little key bed on the Digitone and you can play chords on it. I would recommend getting an external keyboard like the Keystep or something similar to play. You can connect it via MIDI and it's super easy. And it's just like having a synth, an FM synth that you can gig with, you can record and use as like a traditional instrument like that. That said, it can obviously do so much more than just be played like an 8-voice synth, and we're going to get into a bit of that when we talk about the Elektron Workflow. And on the contrary, if you're looking for a dedicated sampler, then you obviously want to go with the Digitakt because that's a totally different creative tool than a synthesizer. Even though you can play the samples monophonically with an external keyboard, that's not really the point of a sampler. It's more so to create samples and use your own sounds to make interesting beats and patterns and songs that way. And that's not to say that you can't make full songs with the Digitone, because you definitely can, but I think it's a little bit more intuitive on the Digitakt, whereas the Digitone is more easy and intuitive to play as a classical like instrument rather than the Digitakt, which is more of like a groove box. So let's talk a little bit about the Elektron Workflow that I referenced. And when you're looking at the Elektron devices, this is something that you'll hear about a lot. And just know that the Elektron Workflow just kind of refers to the way that the sequencer works on most of the Elektron devices. And it works exactly the same on the Digitakt and the Digitone. So as I was talking about with the Digitakt, you have this grid that's part of a pattern, right? And you can either manually enter steps or live record. But even when you're live recording, each of the hits, the notes that you play are locked to a certain point on the grid. And this can be adjusted with swing or quantization or microtiming, but it all exists in sort of a discrete point on that grid somewhere. So you're not recording free audio the way that you would be in a DAW or say like a tape reel or the OP1, which utilizes a digital tape reel, where there isn't really a defined discrete point that a step of sound, a moment of sound occurs. So yeah, you might hear this and think, why? That kind of sounds limiting. But essentially what it enables you to do is apply automation to those very discrete points in time. And if you're not familiar, automation is basically just the changing of a sound parameter over time. You're basically automating it. So if you change the volume over the course of time of a song, it happens automatically. You're recording that parameter change into the playback of the song rather than you having to like turn the volume up as the song plays every time. So it's being digitally automated. And you can live record in automation with the Elektron devices as part of the workflow. But one of the best parts about it, in my opinion, is that you can do what's called parameter locking, where you basically press a step and you can adjust any parameter that you can control with the knobs, basically any setting, and change that setting just for that discrete moment in time. And you can do that with every step. So as you can see, it opens up a lot of possibilities for sound shaping and sort of embedding motion into your tracks with these two boxes. So one component of this that's super powerful with the Digitakt and Digitone is that they both utilize what is referred to as a sound pool. And basically that's just a parameter or a setting that contains all of the sounds in a project that you want to put there. And you can use that as like a parameter change to be automated. So you can change the sound of a specific single voice per step. So even though you only have 8 voices on the Digitakt, for example, you can change one of those voices just for a single step, or you could use one track, so one sample that you have assigned, and change that sample for every single step that occurs within a pattern. And you can do the same thing with the synth voice on the Digitone. So even though you're limited to 8 tracks and 4 tracks on the Digitakt and Digitone respectively, it can really just be blasted way open. And it takes a lot of patience at first and kind of learning that workflow. But once you sort of get that muscle memory going and understand how it works, it's really easy to just quickly go through and build up your tracks to be super complex in a short amount of time. So yeah, you can really push the hardware to its limits using full advantage of this Elektron workflow. And the 2 boxes, since they share that same workflow, are really easy to kind of go back and forth between. If you've already spent a lot of time learning the Digitakt, it's super easy to hop over to the Digitone and vice versa. Because of this, the devices are really, really easy to sort of use together as a little duo hardware setup, and they're super easy to connect. I have a video on that, which you can check out in the card if you're curious about how I sync those devices. And yeah, they're super fun, and they obviously complement each other musically really well because one's a sampler and one's a synth, and you can even like resample synth sounds into the Digitakt if you find that you're running out of voices on the Digitone. So let's talk a little bit more about who each box might be for. I do want to say that, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people will agree with this, that in general, a sampler is a much more flexible tool than a synthesizer. And that's because a sampler can be whatever you want it to be. You can sample synths into a sampler and then just play those back and have that piece of music that you've created on a synthesizer played back on the sampler without having to take up, voice space, like I mentioned, on the synthesizer. You could compose a whole piece on the Digitone, sample it into the Digitakt, and just play it back that way. That might not be the most fun or most efficient use case, but it's something that you can do and something to keep in mind. And as I mentioned before, a synth more so has a really specific use case where if you want an instrument, you really want a powerful sound design forward FM synth, then the Digitone is definitely a great choice. That said, using the parameter locking abilities and the Elektron workflow with the Digitone, you can create like full beats, a fully composed beat on the device. It makes a lot of really great drum sounds achievable with FM synthesis, and there are a lot of great presets to kind of tweak and learn from if you're interested in doing this. And you can put your entire drum kit on one track using the sound locks per step, and then have another track for pads, another track for melody, and another track for bass. Lots of flexibility, definitely a bit more meticulous, but it's really possible, and a lot of people do work this way. So yeah, you really got to consider which use case applies to you. Personally, I got the Digitakt first because I knew I wanted a sampler and something to sort of mangle sound with and sort of figure out what direction I wanted to take my music in after I was really into modular and the OP1. So it was good to have a fully featured sampler to work through that with. I ended up adding the Digitone to my setup because I knew that I wanted a polyphonic dedicated synthesizer, and I just, kind of had to go with the Digitone because of how well it works with the Digitakt. It didn't make so much sense for me to go with something like the Minilog XD by Korg, which is still a really fantastic sounding synth, and I still actually really want one. But the fact that the two Elektron devices are kind of, made to work together, it seemed silly not to go that route in terms of expanding the functionality of my own setup. So yeah, fully recommend both devices. I've had overwhelmingly positive experiences with both. But if you're interested in some of the more specifics of my thoughts on each device, I would recommend checking out reviews that I have out for both of these. I'll put both of those in the description of the video. And truth be told, I actually ended up returning the first Digitakt that I got. And you can hear more about that story by checking out the Digitakt review, which I definitely recommend doing if you kind of want to hear more about if you might be ready for the Digitakt, because I definitely wasn't the first time that I got it. They're not super beginner friendly, and they do take a lot of focus and effort to sort of learn that Elektron workflow. So keep that in mind. All right, thanks for joining today. Peace, y'all. I hope to see you in the next one. Like, subscribe, comment, blah, blah, blah.